Have you ever had to fight for justice when no one believed you? Imagine standing in front of the very person who denied you fairness, with the entire courtroom watching. That's exactly where 12-year-old Aaliyah found herself, face to face with the judge who had dismissed her case before even hearing her side. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with lawyers, reporters, and community members waiting over the proceedings like a heavy cloud. Today, this trial would determine Aaliyah's future, her fight for justice, her chance to be heard, to speak her truth. The eyes of the room were on her, some sympathetic, others skeptical, but all watching closely as the 12-year-old girl stood at the witness stand, Aaliyah's arming to see what would happen. The air was thick with tension. The buzz of anticipation hanging was wrapped in a bandage, the wound from a recent injury still tender, but her gaze was unwavering. Her hands trembled slightly, betraying the fear that lay beneath the surface, but her eyes were filled with something stronger: determination. She had waited too long for this moment, the moment when she could stand up and be heard. The moment when she could finally tell her story. Across from her sat Judge Raymond Wallace, a man whose reputation for his old-school, no-nonsense approach to the law had already earned him the title of being racially biased. He sat back in his chair, arms crossed, looking like he had no time for whatever Aaliyah had to say. He was the embodiment of the system that had ignored her pain before. And now, here he was again, sitting in judgment over her words. "This is a waste of my time," Judge Wallace scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. He didn't even bother to look up at her as he spoke. "You're here again, claiming what? That you're the victim?" The words stung, but Aaliyah didn't flinch. She had been dismissed before. She had been ignored, belittled, and silenced for far too long. But not today. Today, she would make her voice heard. She had waited too long, had fought too hard, to let this man's dismissive attitude stop her now. Aaliyah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the room pressing against her. She looked directly at Judge Wallace, her eyes steady and unyielding. She wasn't a child who would be brushed aside. She had something important to say, and no one, not even him, could take that away from her. "Your Honor." Aaliyah's voice rang clear and strong, surprising herself with how firm she sounded. "I'm not here to waste your time. I'm here because what happened to me matters. It's not just my story, it's the truth." There was a brief pause as the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Aaliyah could feel the eyes of everyone on her, but she didn't let it break her focus. She had been silenced for far too long, by her abuser, by a system that didn't want to believe her, by people who thought a 12-year-old girl didn't have anything worth saying. But she wasn't just anyone. She was Aaliyah, and her truth would not be dismissed. The judge's lips tightened, but he remained silent. The tension in the room thickened, but Aaliyah stood her ground, knowing that the hardest part of the fight was over, the decision to finally speak up. "Tell us your side of the story," the prosecutor said, urging her on, clearly sensing the shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. Aaliyah took another steadying breath, her hands now less shaky as she began to speak. As she recounted what had happened to her, the room seemed to hang on her every word. Each sentence was a battle, each moment a victory. Aaliyah wasn't just telling her story, she was fighting for her life, her dignity, her right to be heard. She was fighting against a system that had failed her, and a man who had already written her off as just another victim. But she was more than that. She was strong, she was brave, and she was ready. In this moment, Aaliyah wasn't just a girl on trial. She was someone who refused to be silenced anymore. Have you ever been dismissed or silenced when you were telling the truth? Share your experience in the comments. Aaliyah never wanted to be in court. But she had no choice. 1 month earlier, she had been walking home from school, the familiar streets of her neighborhood lining her path, as she glanced around, lost in her thoughts. She had just finished a long day, the weight of schoolwork, and the typical middle school stress lingering in her mind, when everything changed. She had made a quick stop at a local convenience store, just to pick up a snack for the walk home. Aaliyah had no intention of causing any trouble. She just wanted a bag of chips and to get back to her family. But, as she stepped out of the store, she was confronted by a white police officer, Officer Gregson, who immediately accused her of shoplifting. Aaliyah's heart raced as the words hit her. She had done nothing wrong. She hadn't stolen a thing, and yet Officer Gregson stood there, eyes cold and dismissive, certain that he had caught her in the act. Aaliyah tried to explain, tried to tell him that she hadn't taken anything, but Officer Gregson didn't listen. His mind was already made up. His grip on her wrist tightened, his fingers digging into her skin as he twisted her arm behind her back. The pain shot through her like a knife. She tried to pull away, to get free, but his strength overpowered her. Without warning, he slammed her against the wall, the force of the impact leaving her breathless. Her wrist cracked under the pressure. The pain was immediate, overwhelming, and the world spun around her as she crumpled to the ground. She could hear the officer's harsh words, but they felt distant, muffled by the shock of what had just happened. She hadn't stolen anything. Why was he doing this? Why was he treating her like this? She was a 12-year-old girl, and yet, to him, she was nothing more than another suspect, another person to be controlled, another black child to be handled with force. Aaliyah's family was devastated when they found out what had happened. The injury to her wrist required medical attention, but it wasn't just the broken bone that hurt. It was the humiliation, the injustice. Aaliyah and her family knew they had to fight back. They went to the police station to file a complaint, hoping for some kind of justice. But when that didn't lead anywhere, they decided to take the case to court. They believed that the law would right the wrong. They thought that the system would work in their favor, that the truth would prevail. But they were wrong. When the case went before Judge Raymond Wallace, everything seemed to fall apart. Judge Wallace was known for his no-nonsense, hard-line approach, but it quickly became clear that he wasn't interested in hearing Aaliyah's side. He dismissed the case almost immediately, without any regard for her injury or the injustice she had suffered. The gavel came down with finality. No evidence, no case. Next, Judge Wallace had said, his voice echoing through the courtroom, a harsh dismissal that reverberated in Aaliyah's chest. There was no trial, no investigation, nothing. Her words, her pain, her truth, they all meant nothing to him. He had already decided. It was over before it had even begun. Aaliyah left the courthouse that day feeling defeated, like the world had once again failed her. But what Wallace didn't know was that new evidence had come to light. Evidence that would shake the courtroom to its core. This time, Aaliyah wasn't going to let her truth be ignored. She wasn't going to be silenced, and this time justice would find its way. She was ready. The fight wasn't over. And now, here she was, standing before him once again. But this time, things were different. Aaliyah felt a sense of resolve settle over her as she stood at the witness stand, looking across the room at the judge, who had dismissed her so easily the last time. Her lawyer stood beside her looking confident, the weight of the case resting on their shared shoulders. But it wasn't just her lawyer who stood behind her. This time, the entire community was with her. They were watching, waiting for her to speak, and Aaliyah could feel their presence like a powerful force in the room. The courtroom was thick with tension as Aaliyah raised her voice, her words cutting through the stillness. "Judge Wallace," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "Last time, you refused to listen to me. But today, I'm here with proof." Judge Wallace leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He hadn't expected this. He didn't take teenagers seriously, especially not one like Aaliyah. To him, this was just another nuisance, another case he would dismiss without a second thought. He regarded her as nothing more than a child who didn't know her place. But this time, Aaliyah was ready. She had been preparing for this moment. "Proof," Judge Wallace scoffed, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "What proof?" Aaliyah didn't hesitate. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the USB drive she had carefully placed there earlier that morning. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her hands were steady as she pulled it out. This was the moment. This was the evidence that would turn the tide in her favor. "This," she said, holding the small device up for everyone in the room to see. "This is the proof." The courtroom murmured, a low buzz of curiosity and skepticism filling the air. Aaliyah's lawyer, standing tall beside her, took the drive from her hand and handed it to the bailiff. The bailiff walked it over to the judge, who was still looking at Aaliyah with an expression that seemed to say he didn't believe a word she said. Judge Wallace's smirk faded. His eyes flicked from the screen to Aaliyah, then to the prosecutor, and back to the footage. He could no longer deny what was right in front of him. The room had shifted. The power had shifted. The truth had been revealed, and it was Aaliyah's truth. The prosecutor, once so confident, was now speechless. He fumbled for words, but none came. The weight of the video, the weight of Aaliyah's courage hung over him like a shadow. Aaliyah stood tall, her eyes never leaving the judge. She had done it. She had faced the man who had tried to silence her and expose the injustice she had suffered. Today, she wasn't just a victim. She was a force, a voice that couldn't be ignored. The courtroom remained silent, but for Aaliyah, the silence was filled with victory. The moment had come, and she had taken her stand. What played on the screen changed everything. The footage flickered to life, and immediately, the room grew still. It was security footage from a nearby store, the same footage that had mysteriously disappeared during the original trial. The room watched in stunned silence as the video unfolded. There, clearly visible, was Officer Gregson. The camera showed him approaching Aaliyah in the store, grabbing her without cause and pinning her to the wall. He twisted her arm behind her back with no provocation, slamming her forcefully to the ground. She was powerless to stop him, and the violence of the action was undeniable. Aaliyah had done nothing wrong. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, but the footage told a story that couldn't be ignored. The video revealed the truth, and for the first time, it became clear to everyone in the room. Aaliyah was the victim, not the perpetrator. She had been wronged, and the evidence was right there for everyone to see. Gasps filled the courtroom. The whispers that had been circulating in the air before the video was played suddenly stopped. Everyone was silent, and the air seemed to thicken as the reality of the situation settled in. The judge, who had scoffed at Aaliyah only moments before, sat frozen in his chair. His smirk, once so confident, vanished completely. The room's collective disbelief was palpable. The prosecutor, who had been so sure of his case, fumbled with his papers, looking everywhere but at the screen. He had no words. Officer Gregson, who had been sitting in the courtroom, suddenly turned ghostly pale. His hands shook, and he tried to avoid looking directly at the footage, but there was no escaping the undeniable truth that was being shown. The image of him forcibly subduing Aaliyah was now public, and his actions were on display for everyone to see. "That can't be real," Judge Wallace muttered under his breath, his voice filled with disbelief. He leaned forward in his chair, staring at the screen with wide eyes. "Where did you get this?" His words, usually filled with authority, now seemed uncertain, rattled. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely, and it was clear that the judge, for once, didn't know how to handle the situation. Aaliyah's lawyer, who had been standing by with calm composure, now turned to face the judge. His voice was firm, steady, and full of conviction. "It was anonymously sent to the news last week," he said, not an ounce of hesitation in his words. "The truth always comes out, Judge Wallace." Aaliyah's lawyer didn't flinch. He didn't need to. The footage spoke for itself. The courtroom, filled with reporters, witnesses, and officials, could no longer deny what had happened. The video had shattered the narrative that had been spun against Aaliyah. The lies were exposed, and the truth stood tall in front of them all. The prosecutor, still struggling to regain his composure, stared blankly at the screen, unable to respond. There was nothing he could say. The case against Aaliyah had evaporated in front of his eyes. The power of the footage, the weight of the truth, had rendered his arguments meaningless. The once boisterous and confident prosecutor was now reduced to silence, unable to face the reality of the situation. The judge's face had drained of color as he looked at the video again, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The gavel that had once been so powerful, so final, now felt insignificant. How could he continue to side with the prosecution when the truth was laid bare in front of him? Officer Gregson, who had once been sure of his authority, now looked as though he wanted to disappear. The color drained from his face as he stared at the footage, realizing that his actions were no longer in the shadows. They were public, they were undeniable, and now there was nowhere left for him to hide. The truth had come to light, and with it, Aaliyah's path to justice had finally begun. The courtroom was in chaos. The once dismissed case had just exploded into a full-blown scandal. What had seemed like a routine, easily dismissed accusation against a 12-year-old girl was now the centerpiece of a heated legal battle. The truth had come to light in a way no one could ignore. Aaliyah's story, once brushed aside, was now the very foundation of the case. The prosecutor, who had spent the entirety of the trial confidently pursuing what he believed to be a straightforward case, had no choice but to reopen the investigation. There was no denying it anymore. The video footage had done what words could not: expose the corruption and misconduct that had been swept under the rug. Officer Gregson, who had falsely accused Aaliyah and violently arrested her, was immediately placed under investigation. His actions, once buried under the weight of his authority, now stood exposed for all to see. Judge Wallace, who had previously dismissed Aaliyah's case with such arrogance, sat silently at his desk, caught in the middle of a storm he hadn't anticipated. His earlier dismissal of Aaliyah's words, his disregard for her injury and her truth, now came back to haunt him. The evidence was irrefutable. The truth could no longer be ignored. "I should have listened," Wallace finally admitted, his voice quieter than before. The words were reluctant, barely above a whisper. The authority he once held so confidently now sounded weak, unsure. Aaliyah had forced him into a position where he could no longer hide behind his biases. The truth had cracked the veneer of his judicial demeanor, exposing him for the flaws he had tried to cover up for so long. For the first time, Aaliyah saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Fear. Fear that he had been caught. Fear that his unchecked power was slipping away. In that moment, she knew that he wasn't the person in control anymore. The system that had ignored her, that had allowed Officer Gregson's actions to go unchecked, had been exposed. The power was shifting. And Aaliyah was standing at the center of it all. Judge Wallace had no choice but to reverse his previous ruling. Aaliyah's case, which he had dismissed so easily before, was officially reopened. There was no more denying her right to justice. There was no more sweeping her pain under the rug. The courtroom, which had been tense with the uncertainty of what would happen next, now stood on the brink of something far bigger than anyone had expected. As Aaliyah stood there, her body still tense with adrenaline, a wave of emotion washed over her. The weight of the last few weeks, the fight for justice, the countless nights she had spent preparing for this moment, all of it had led to this. Her truth was finally being acknowledged. Her voice was finally being heard. The moment the judge's ruling was made official, the entire courtroom stood up and clapped. Aaliyah could feel the energy shift around her. What had once felt like an uphill battle, a fight no one believed she could win, was now a victory. The applause wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. It was a collective recognition of the power of truth, of perseverance, and of the fight for justice. Aaliyah walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, the weight of the world lifted off her shoulders. The doors that had once seemed locked to her now felt wide open. Justice had finally started to tip in the right direction. The truth had triumphed, and with it, Aaliyah had found something more powerful than any verdict. She had found her voice, and no one could take that from her. A few months later, the repercussions of Aaliyah's courageous stand had sent shockwaves through the system. Officer Gregson, who had once wielded his badge as a symbol of unchecked power, was fired. His badge was stripped away, a public acknowledgment of his misconduct. His violent actions, once buried under the weight of authority, had finally caught up with him. The truth had forced his downfall. But the ripple effects didn't stop there. A full investigation into Judge Wallace's past cases was launched, scrutinizing his history of biased rulings and decisions made in disregard of justice. The exposure of his role in dismissing Aaliyah's case had opened the door for a broader look at the legal system he had helped uphold. The foundation that once protected him from accountability was crumbling, and the world was paying attention. The very system that had failed Aaliyah was now facing the consequences of its own negligence. As for Aaliyah, her fight for justice had not only changed the courtroom, it had changed her future. She was offered a scholarship to study law, an opportunity that came because of her unwavering courage to stand up against injustice. People saw in her the kind of determination that could change the world. She had taken a system that tried to silence her and turned it on its head. And now she was going to use her voice to ensure others didn't have to fight the same battle she had. Aaliyah stood on stage at a rally. The crowd gathered before her, their eyes focused on her as she prepared to speak about her experience. The weight of the moment hung in the air. This was no longer just about her story. It was about everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced by the systems meant to protect them. Aaliyah had become a symbol, a beacon for those who needed to know that they could fight back. Her voice rang clear and strong as she addressed the crowd. "They tried to silence me," she said, the words carrying the weight of everything she had endured. "They tried to ignore me, but I fought back, and now they have no choice but to listen." Aaliyah's words were a declaration. She had faced the worst, but she had come out stronger. She had fought for herself, for her truth, and for the truth of others who were still suffering in silence. In this moment, she understood the power of her voice, and she knew that she could never be silenced again. The crowd erupted into applause, the energy in the air electric with the power of her words. But Aaliyah knew this wasn't just a moment of victory for her, it was a victory for everyone who had ever felt like their voice didn't matter. She had shown them all that change was possible. She had proven that one person, no matter how young, could change everything. "No matter who tries to silence you," she continued, her voice rising with conviction, "never stop fighting for the truth." Her story wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a reminder to everyone who heard it that the truth always had a way of coming to light, no matter how hard others tried to hide it. What do you think of Aaliyah's story? Have you ever had to stand up to injustice? Tell us in the comments.